So the handgun industry's in a pretty weird spot right now, and it kinda has me worried. If you sit tight, I'll explain why. It's not that there aren't new guns being released. There's probably releasing more new guns now more than ever. It's just that the industry is in this weird spot where all of the attention is being put on guns that cost more than $1,000, and the features that they're wowing us with is ports and compensators. About 2 years ago, everybody kind of got together, decided they liked softer shooting guns, so we've ported and compensated all the things. The problem with that is that adds cost to a marketplace that's already saturated with expensive stuff. And that leads to another problem of some people really like ported and compensated guns, and that's all that they want to shoot, and a lot of people don't, and they don't want to buy a gun that costs more than $1,000. Problem with ported and compensated guns, as nice as they are to shoot, is that they return a lot more noise to the shooter, and they have a more narrow operating window to where they're easier to choke on suboptimal ammunition, which is the cheap stuff that everybody shoots most of the time they're at the range. But what's more troubling is what happens after we have ported and compensated all the things, like what's going to come next. Let me walk you through kind of modern development in pistols and what that's looked like so you can understand where I'm coming from. So going back to the early 2010s is that everybody had figured out how to make small 9mm pistols. Previously, almost pocket-sized guns were in mouse calibers, not suitable for self-defense, that's air quotes. But then you saw stuff like the Kel-Tec P380 that led to the Ruger LCP. Smith & Wesson came out with the shielded 9mm, and that kicked off a whole host of other guns that were trying to copy it with, like the Springfield Armory XDS. Glock eventually got on board with their Glock 43 and 42s. And then SIG was like, hold my beer, and came out with the Sig Sauer P365, which was the same size as all of those guns, but held 10 rounds in basically a smaller frame. And that led to a whole bunch more copycats of everybody trying to make a high capacity, skinny, small 9mm. Roughly 2018-2019 timeframe, when the modular handgun trial series was all done with, we were flooded with new duty capable guns that were the rejects from the MHS trials. That's going to include stuff like the Beretta APX, the Smith & Wesson M&P 2.0, the Glock Gen 5s. There was just a ton of guns that came out in a small amount of time that were all like duty flavored 9mm pistols. And that started to kind of fade around 2020, 2021, and just kind of whatever. And quietly in the early 2020s, Sig Sauer again, I know we've said their name a couple times in this video, and that makes some of you guys upset, but bear with me. Sig Sauer kind of, in my opinion, quietly kicked off the whole compensated and ported game. They released two guns. There was the P320 Spectre Comp, which was on the heels of the P365 XL Spectre Comp. The 365 XL Spectre Comp is where they put the shorter barrel in the longer slide and put the vents in the top of the slide. And the 320 Spectre Comp basically slapped on a conventional compensator on the end of a 320. And around that same time, Springfield Armory released the Hellcat RDP, which was a dotted compensated micro carry pistol from the factory. Then what we saw from the handgun market was a lot of people were taking the guns they already had and doing those kinds of things to them, and that was pretty fun for a little bit. But shortly thereafter, Springfield Armory kind of figured out that you can program CNC machines to make 2011s that could just be assembled without a bunch of hand fitting, and the magazines were generally good enough to just sell at a big scale. And all of a sudden, the American gun buying market for the low price of $1,400 was introduced to the Double Stack 2011, which $1,400 is still a lot of money, but at the time, you know, you had Staccatos, which were north of $2,000, and then there were semi-custom and custom builds that were $3,000 to $5,000. Those were back in the days when an Atlas was affordable at just $5,000. When you consider that some of their models range from like high sixes into eights now, affordable. And what happened was kind of two things all at once. The first was there was a frenzy down at the bottom with a race to the bottom. You had stuff like the Live Free Armory Apollo that came out, was an American-made 2011 for less than $1,000. You had all the Turkish guns that were, you know, well under $1,000 that came out. But at the same time, a bunch of small machine shops were like, hey, I can do that, and just started making 2011s for like the $3,000 to $5,000 price point, which is kind of where we're at today, where there's like a bazillion 2011s coming out, but they're all at like super expensive prices. And it feels very much like, you know, ARs were back in like the late 2009's kind of time frame where everybody was making an AR and like, it's different because it's got our name on it, but it was basically the same gun over and over again. That's kind of what's happening on 2011s, kind of. But with the launch of that Prodigy, like us collectively as consumers, we're kind of trained $1,400 isn't a lot of money to spend for a pistol. And so that's kind of where we're at right now. Like we're into the, now we put a bunch of ports and compensators on 2011 pistols. That's what's kind of happening now. 6 Hours back in the mix with their P211 GTO, their comped version of a 2011 sort of. But at the same time, kind of flying in the face of all that was Smith & Wesson's Bodyguard 2.0 release, which for the past couple years has been the #1 gun in America, at least if you believe any of the gun buying websites based on consumer sales. The Bodyguard 2.0 is sort of a bright patch in this ported and compensated and expensive age because it's relatively inexpensive and it's a small 380 pistol, which is actually doing quite well. And it's well deserved because the Bodyguard 2.0 is a remarkable pistol. It's just great. But it's pretty clear that the 2011 has replaced the 1911 as far as like the collector gun that everybody wants to brag about. It's no longer talking about their 45, it's talking about their 2011 9mm. But what's more kind of puzzling, and I don't have the imagination to be able to answer, is where do we go from here? We've made the guns as small and as light as possible, in some instances being too light and too small to be, usable. We've made the guns super expensive and as easy to shoot as possible. I don't know what happens unless they come up with like a new cartridge that all of a sudden like 9mm isn't the go-to anymore, which would be incredibly difficult to do at this point. We can't just be like stuck in this constant, like let's reskin the old gun and sell it as a new gun again, which is kind of what we've been doing for the past, I don't know, it feels like 5 years at this point, although it's taken on sort of different forms along the way. So I really don't know, and I'd love to hear from you guys where you think we go from here, because while there's tons of attention at the high-end price point, there's loads of the market that would love to look at something that's a little bit more attainable in like the middle hundreds price point, and it just feels like all the manufacturers have more or less moved on from that price point. So I'd be curious to know where you think handguns go from here. Let me know in the comments.